Okay, so the first question is, what's a scroll saw? Well, our friends at Webster, not the ones down the street, but the ones that wrote the dictionary, they define it as this. It's a ribbon-like saw stretched in a frame, which is adapted for sawing curved outlines. It's pretty basic, isn't it? And somewhat inaccurate, to say the least. Who invented the scroll saw? There's a lot of different ideas, but here is a popular chain of events. In the 1500s, a German craftsman developed a way to make fine, narrow saw blades. Without that invention, these saws would have not come about. A French workman named Boule developed a frame to hold these blades in order to cut intricate designs. The frame, called the Boule saw, looks similar to fret and coping saws today. The Boule saw made the cutting of intricate designs popular throughout Europe. Now, while there is some evidence to suggest the concept of using thin blades in a reciprocating machine was in practice before the 1800s, the first recorded patent of this type of machine was issued to a man called Mr. Macduff in 1829. And by 1857, there were at least 3 patents for improvements to the scroll saw. By the 1860s, the first mechanical powered scroll saws began to appear in the United States. They used foot powered treadles, some had hand cranks. Then, by the 1920s, the term scroll saw was in common use throughout America, and manufacturers such as Barnes, New Rogers, Star, Lester, and believe it or not, a company called Hobbies began mass producing them. Now, these saws all come under a basic premise that the blade moves strictly up and down. But even with that, remember, they can rip cut, cross cut, duplicate, make compound cuts and joints in thick, thin, soft, or hardwoods. And of course, straight lines or an infinite amount of curves and different angles. They can even cut plastic and metals. You can prepare wood for a lot of other projects, such as getting ready for turning, and they can produce anything from just a simple door wedge to a dovetail joint and even beyond. They are well suited for woodworkers who are very short on patience, or those who want to spend many hours making precision and very intricate cuts. It can be done in thicknesses from veneer to 2-inch thick stock. They're also very economical. Even the smallest of scraps can be used. And what really sets these saws apart in a class of their own is their ability to make what's called a pierce cut. Now, that's the ability to cut on the inside perimeter of a workpiece, entering through a hole without cutting into the piece's edge. Well, you might say, well, a saber saw can do that, but try doing this with a saber saw. There's no kickback, no giant spinning cutters. While they can cut the flesh, it's awful hard to cut off a finger with a scroll saw. Now, supporting these saws are literally thousands of projects and patterns available for these saws that make them either a versatile supplement or a standalone addition to anybody's workshop. In fact, there are individuals that make full-time livings with a scroll saw. What are the different types of scroll saws? First, we have to understand that all modern scroll saws must have some way of converting the rotary motion of the motor, either with a foot pedal or a power source, to an up or down reciprocating action. The saws are gauged in strokes per minute. Stroke lengths are going to vary from 3/8 of an inch to 1 inch and 3/8, but usually 3/4 to 1 inch is most common. Each saw also has a throat measurement, and this is the measurement from the blade here, as you can see, all the way back to the pivot point in the saw. And that regulates, again, how big of a part could be spun on the saws. Now, the saws themselves come in 2 distinct groups. First is rigid arm, and the other is constant tension. Constant tension saws are also divided down into both C-arm and parallel arm designs. First, let's discuss the rigid arm saws. For 50 years or more, this type of saw ruled the scroll saw kingdom, but it slipped into near extinction with the introduction of the parallel arm saws in the late 70s. These type of saws can easily be identified by the rigid or fixed arm that comes up from the base and comes up and over the table. Usually these saws were made of some kind of cast material, so they weighed a ton, but that weight made it excellent to dampen the vibration caused by the type of saw. The blades were kept tight by a spring inside the upper arm end, while the bottom of the blade fastened to the clamp underneath the saw that hooks into a drive can link. The link was pulled down by the rotary action of the wheel attached to the drive motor. The spring is always pulling up, thus the blade tension is kept tight. This action produced the up and down movement of the blade, which of course caused the sawing action. The strokes were usually for this type of saw quite vertical, but they had some tension problems, usually from the top to the bottom. One was a little more taut, the other one was a little more slack. So when using very fine blades, they had a propensity to break. Now the next class was the constant tension saws, and they were the C-arm saws. They are identified by a single arm that was shaped like a C. Now the C-shaped arm basically pivoted on a single point at the back of the arm, resting in a support bracket. There was a drive link system similar to the rigid arm, which oscillated the C-frame up and down, producing the cutting action. Unfortunately, due to the rocking action of the assembly arm, the blades did not have the best vertical control to keep the blade path truly vertical. But on the plus side, the movement from the true vertical produces a quite aggressive cutting action. So often these saws were better suited to production work rather than very detailed work or fret type work as we know it today. The blade on these C-arm saws is held by two clamping devices, and it's tensioned by a knob on the upper arm. Again, there were a lot of different manufacturers of these saws. Lots of them are still around, and some very low-end saws of this type were being made up until just quite recently. Our third type of saw is the constant tension design called parallel arm saws. Interestingly, the design has been around for over a century, but it didn't really come to full fruition until the 1980s. The Heger saw was one of the first ones that really improved on this design. Unlike the C-arm with a single pivot point, these saws had two. The 2 points make for a very good true vertical blade path. So it provides for a machine that will make some very detailed cuts. It's sometimes kind of hard to identify the parallel arm saw without removing the side arm covers. Much of the pivot linkage is behind those covers. But the blade is attached to the clamps in the front of the arms, and there are several tensioning systems available. Again, there is a drive link attached to the motor, and it pushes up on the bottom arm and pulls down on the top arm. The fourth type of saw is a variation from the parallel arm saw. It's called the double parallel link saw. Main difference here, instead of 2 pivot points, there's 4. The motor action drives a vertical rocker, which is different from the other saws, and this back and forth action is connected to a connecting rod. The vertical rocker forces a pair of horizontal links to go back and forwards, forcing the top and bottom rocker assemblies to pivot, and the blade moves up and down. Kind of sounds complex, but trust me, these saws are sweet, and they're the most popular saws today. But remember, because of all that extra engineering and linkage, they're going to cost you definitely more money. So, are your heads kind of spinning like a lathe now? Don't worry. What really counts is that these wonderful saws have evolved into fascinating cutting machines. So stay tuned, as next time we're going to dive into scroll saw features and the selection of the perfect scroll saw for you. Remember, you can trust Mike, because I would never pull your stash. What are the different types of scroll saw? Tripes. You eat those, don't you? I don't.
You might want to do that again.